This is an exciting time for space exploration. In February, Odysseus became the first commercial spacecraft to complete a soft landing on the lunar surface. It was the first American moon landing since 1972. China is now the second leading space power. It recently brought back to Earth geological samples from the far side of the moon, the first time that we've had samples from this hard-to-access part of our nearest celestial neighbour. Missions have found evidence of ice at the lunar South Pole, which should enable us to generate the fuel needed for onwards missions to Mars. At the same time, there are troubling developments in space. The problem of space debris only seems to grow, with reports in the news recently that International Space Station personnel had to take emergency shelter in their spacecraft because debris from a defunct satellite threatened to damage the ISS. Many analysts fear that the problem of space debris may become so acute that it's no longer possible to safely launch spacecraft or reliably use satellites. Space assets are now wartime targets. Coinciding with its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia hacked the Viasat satellite network, blocking the internet connection of thousands of customers across Europe. Russia has declared that any Western commercial satellite contributing to the war effort in Ukraine is a legitimate target. Concerningly, in February, reports emerged that Russia was planning to deploy a nuclear weapon in Earth's orbit. A nuclear detonation in space would be devastating. The electromagnetic pulse generated by the last nuclear explosion in the upper atmosphere back in 1962 damaged streetlights and the telephone network in Hawaii, 1,500 kilometres from the explosion. It caused electrical surges on aeroplanes and radio blackouts. And in space, the blast caused at least 6 satellites to fail, and the radiation it generated lingered in the atmosphere for months. For the major powers, space assets are no longer just enablers for terrestrial conflict. Space itself is a warfighting domain. Countless everyday activities depend on space-based technologies, from weather forecasting, communications, stock markets and financial systems, and of course, navigation. Widespread loss of space assets, whether by kinetic, cyber, or some other form of attack, would be catastrophic and felt around the world. As a researcher who looks at the role that international law plays in global politics, the question that I have is, can international law stop the outbreak of war in outer space? As we think about the likelihood of conflict in space, it's easy to focus on the rivalry and hostility between space powers and despair. After all, there hasn't been a new space treaty since 1979. What possible hope do we have of negotiating a new treaty in the current geopolitical climate? And would states comply, even if we could? A look back through the history of space law, however, points us to the positive role that shared threats to fundamental concerns of national interest can play. Let's revisit two key moments in the history of space law. The space age opened in October 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite into Earth's orbit. America followed in January 1958 with Explorer 1. The American and Soviet space programs had different strengths. They prioritised different goals. While those goals included scientific exploration, they also included a desire for military advantage, intelligence gathering, and demonstrating technological prowess in the ideological battle between communism and capitalism. The overarching dynamic was competition. Renowned space historian Walter McDougall observed that competition was the engine of spaceflight. Without it, space programs would have been stunted with malnutrition. While control of space was to play for, it was a competition neither state could afford to lose. But space programs are expensive, so it was also a race they couldn't afford to win for very much longer. Despite being ideological and geopolitical rivals, the United States and the Soviet Union had a shared interest in minimising the cost, the financial, power and status cost of coming second in the race to the moon. This was the political context in which the first space treaty was negotiated, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. The treaty expressed lofty goals about ensuring that space was to be used for peaceful purposes and that it was to be the province of all mankind. It was also a clever mechanism by which the space powers agreed to place limits on their competition in space. Agreeing such limits released the space powers from costly investment in crewed lunar mission and freed them to focus on space activities from which they would derive the greatest strategic benefit. Well, let's take a small step forward to 1972, to another key moment in the development of international law with important implications for space. The USA and the USSR were locked in a ballistic missile arms race. Intercontinental ballistic missiles can deliver a warhead over thousands of kilometres in just minutes. They do this by leaving Earth's atmosphere, travelling through the edge of space and re-entering to hit the target. A nuclear-equipped missile strike can do enormous damage. As one superpower made improvements to its ballistic missile capability or developed a defence system, it triggered a compensating reaction by the other superpower as they each sought to outdo each other. This action-reaction cycle is what we call the arms race. The arms race was tremendously expensive for both states and in the US, unpopular with the electorate. But neither state could afford to let the other get too far ahead. This was another race they couldn't afford to lose. And like the race to the moon, it was hard to tell who had the lead in the arms race. They had a mutual problem. In 1972, the US and USSR agreed a solution in the Treaty on the Limitation of Anti-Ballistic Missile Systems, known as the ABM Treaty. In the ABM Treaty, America and the Soviet Union agreed that they wouldn't deploy defence systems to protect themselves against a missile strike. This included a ban on space-based defence systems. So in practice, the treaty prohibited the placement of weapons in space. In the midst of the Cold War, despite mutual hostility and suspicion, the US and the USSR were prepared to negotiate a treaty foregoing space weapons in order to address their shared interest in pausing the strategic arms race. So where might we be headed in the future? And what role could international law play in managing the threat of war in space? Space powers don't agree to rules of international law for altruistic purposes, but because it's in their interest to do so. Even geopolitical rivals can face the same kinds of problems. In fact, powerful rivals might be more likely to share fundamental threats to their security interests than, say, allies of differing degrees of power. When the stakes are high, rivals can benefit by mediating shared problems through international law, even ones pertaining to sensitive security issues. The history of space law also tells us that states might be more likely to agree rules of international law when they are in close competition with a rival, and the outcome of that competition is uncertain. As China continues to grow as a space power, the next race might propel China and the US to negotiate a space treaty. But what might that treaty address? Well, as China and the US invest in mega projects like the race to Mars and space mining, it seems to me that their interest in ensuring that conflict in low Earth orbit doesn't threaten that investment will only grow. Strategic competition in space is fierce. History says that this might be just the right time to agree new international law for space.